Go ahead, Shai.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you for the diehard stalwarts who are not watching CNN right now. I am giving this lecture to the ether. I mean, to all of you who matter very much to me, but also kind of a little bit to posterity. This is the third installment of this series, Responding to God's Call, Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Spiritual Life. And tonight's topic is a God who cares to the point of suffering, Heschel and God. What I want to try to talk about tonight is a pretty big question. In fact, one could argue the very big question, which is who and what do we mean? Who and what do Jews mean when they say the word God? And I want to state at the outset, because this is kind of important for what I'm going to try and do and not do in the next little while, I'm going to focus tonight, at least during the lecture part, on an exegetical project. That is, on trying to get clear on what Heschel says and on why he says it. And I'm going to spend much less time in this lecture on my own comments or evaluation of those ideas. I'm happy to do that during the question and answer part, but I really want to try to sort of figure out, again, what is Heschel saying and what is animating him in saying those things. So first, maintaining a Jewish way of thinking. In talking to a group of Jewish educators in 1968, Heschel warned of, I'm looking at source 1 now, an insidious danger that constituted nothing less than a block to Jewish theology. I refer, he said, to the Hellenization of Jewish theology. The Hellenization of Jewish theology. This process, which began as early as Philo, Philo's dates 20 BCE to 50 CE, this process, which began as early as Philo, was based on what Heschel thinks is the dangerously misleading assumption that at bottom, Plato and Moses, that is, Greek thinking and biblical thinking, quote, say the same thing. Only Plato would say it in Greek and Moses in Hebrew. Consequently, you can say that Moses was a sort of Hebrew Plato. Heschel insists that this conflation of two very different modes of thinking dominated the world of medieval Jewish philosophy, which is why the world of medieval Jewish philosophy for Heschel is so fundamentally and almost irredeemably problematic, because it operates on the false assumption that you can create a synthesis between Hebrew thinking, biblical thinking on the one hand, and Greek thinking on the other. And as a result, Heschel says, Jewish philosophers too often, quote, talk about God in the language of the Greeks. Now, Heschel is careful to emphasize that he is not opposed to Jewish students being exposed to the non-Jewish world and its ideas. This is not an argument for kind of a Haredi retrenchment. But it is an argument that we ought to be worried that in thinking in what he calls, quote, non-Jewish terms, Jews run the very real risk of losing what is most distinctive and original about Jewish thought. Whatever the strengths of non-Jewish thought, Heschel argues, here is source 2, it is not biblical thinking, it is not rabbinic thinking, it is not Hasidic thinking, it is non-Jewish thinking. A non-Jewish philosophy is fine, but we would like also to have in our thinking a Jewish view of things. We would like to apply the Bible and Chazal, and they are often incongruent with Greek thought. If you take biblical passages or biblical documents or rabbinic statements and submit them to a Greek mind, they often are absurd. They make no sense. But we do want to educate Jews. We wish to maintain Judaism. What can we do about it? By the way, all of this is so far form, not content. Meaning I haven't said anything yet about what are these Jewish ideas that Greek thinking can't tolerate. So far we're setting up a kind of cultural divide. Here Heschel offers an important window into his own theological and educational project, to who he is as a rabbi and a teacher. Source 3, may I say to you personally that this has been my major challenge ever since I began working on my dissertation. That is, how to maintain a Jewish way of thinking. This was the major concern and the major thesis of my dissertation, Die Prophetie. Since that day, I consider this to be my major effort. It is not an easy enterprise. Heschel, as a writer, by the way, would never have spoken this clearly in the first person like this. This is like, transcript of a talk he gives to a bunch of teachers. And so we have him in a slightly different idiom than we're used to. So it's a remarkable first-person window. What I am trying to do, Heschel says, is save Hebrew thinking, biblical thinking, and protect its autonomy in the face of Greek, Hellenistic thinking. Okay, so all of that said, what is the heart of Jewish thinking, according to Heschel? What is it that he is afraid will be lost as a result of trying to make biblical thinking conform to Greek categories? Heschel insists, this, if you've ever read any Heschel, will not surprise you, right? That Jewish theology is rooted in the claim that, here I'm quoting from source 4, God is in search of man. This statement, which he says summarizes all of human history as seen in the Bible, is the fundamental statement about God in Judaism. The fundamental statement about God in Judaism is the claim, Heschel argues, that God is in search of man. Remember, if you want to abstract from Heschel for a minute, what is the first question posed in the Hebrew Bible? God asking Adam, Ayeka, where are you? It is the first question of a God in search of man in that moment, and then Heschel argues, in search of man for the rest of human history. Why is God in search of man? Because Heschel maintains, source 5, God is in need of man. The idea of God being in need of man is central to Judaism and pervades all of the pages of the Bible, of Chazal, of Talmudic literature. But the simple formula, not just looking back quickly at source 4 again, the simple formula, God in search of man, Heschel points out, is not a Hellenistic formula. It is a biblical formula. It is a rabbinic formula. And Heschel would have argued more forcefully, it is an anti-Hellenistic formula. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. So, what we did so far is say, okay, he starts out saying there's a problem of form. Hebrew thinking and Greek thinking can't simply be elided into each other. They're not saying the same thing. And then what's the content? That the Bible's fundamental claim about the world is that God is in search of man, and Greek thinking, for reasons we'll see, fundamentally can't make sense of that idea, let alone take it seriously. That's the dilemma. That's what makes the attempt of synthesizing biblical thinking and Greek thinking, according to Heschel, ultimately impossible and doomed to failure. That's the problem. Because according to Heschel, here he's right, as a historical claim, the kind of Greek thought he's thinking about cannot permit or make space for the idea that there is a God who cares. And yet, that claim, he says, is the very heart of Jewish theology. A God who cares is the heart of Tanakh and is unacceptable to Greek thinking. Rather than surrender its core teaching because perhaps philosophers don't deem it philosophically respectable, Jewish thought, Heschel argues, must proclaim its truths. As we saw during the first 2 lectures, according to Heschel, the world needs these truths more urgently and more desperately than ever. So why can't Greek thought make space for biblical thinking? Why is Heschel so insistent that the biblical and rabbinic idea of God in search of man is incompatible with Hellenistic, and by extension, Hellenic Jewish philosophy? So let's talk about Maimonides for a minute. Now, it goes without saying, I hope, that I cannot do justice to Maimonides on anything, let alone on God, in a few short minutes. I just want to very briefly sketch the broad contours of what I think Maimonides is doing in talking about God in order to better understand what Heschel is so passionately reacting to and rejecting and why. And I'll just say, by the way, that if you read Heschel, you will find very often that when he has to name a villain in theology, it's Philo. And that is Heschel's way of being respectful towards great figures in the tradition. He's not talking about Philo, because I'm going to make the following historical claim. No one who does not teach academic Jewish studies for a living gives a damn about Philo. It doesn't matter, right? Philo is a stand-in for Maimonides, right? And it's much bolder and maybe even risky to launch a full-out assault on Maimonides than it is to say, what am I talking about Philo? He's not talking about Philo. Unless he's a professor of ancient Judaism, he doesn't care about Philo, right? So, and this I can more or less prove. I think this is kind of not like a great innovation on my part. I think it's sort of obvious. By the way, for those who are interested in a more developed attempt to explain what Maimonides is up to, there are various shiurim on our website, and if you have trouble navigating it, I'm happy to help you. So Maimonides, the Rambam, was the most uncompromising proponent of negative theology in the Middle Ages. And according to Maimonides most famously, what that means is, and in a minute I'm going to try to explain what this sentence means, we can never say what God is, but only what God is not. And as I always like to say when I teach Maimonides, our first hermeneutical principle in interpreting the Rambam should be, the Rambam was not an idiot. So when he says that we can't say what God is, but we can only say what God is not, he has to be saying something more interesting than he appears to be at first glance. Because if I say to you that Maimonides says, we can't say God is smart, we can only say that God is not dumb, right? He would fail freshman philosophy, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying something much more interesting than that. And first I'm going to say it in philosophies, and then I'm going to try to say it in English. What Maimonides is saying is not that God is not dumb, but that God is non-dumb. Meaning that dumbness and smartness don't apply to God at all. That it's a category mistake to believe that any terms like that apply to God. In other words, saying that God is not dumb means, oh, dumbness and smartness apply to God, but God doesn't happen to be dumb. Saying that God is non-dumb is saying smartness and dumbness, those don't apply to God. Those are terms that describe humans. So any term we use, and the radicalism of this should take a minute to sink in, right? Any term that we use in speaking both of God and of human beings must be understood as a homonym. As a homonym. In other words, to begin to bring home just how dramatic a statement this is, to say that God is wise and that I am wise is equivalent to saying, quote, a bat comes out at night and Alex Rodriguez swings a bat. The word bat has a totally different meaning in each sentence and each context. So also, Rambam argues, does the word wise when applied to God and to human beings. So to say that God is wise and a person is wise is not to assert any commonality or analogy between God and a person. It is to apply a homonym, like a bat comes out at night and a bat is swung by a baseball player. I'm not actually saying anything. I'm not building any bridge between the human and the divine. Maimonides' critics already in the Middle Ages, by the way, pointed out, you can't possibly really mean that, or else you wouldn't go on saying the words you say. Because you could just as easily at that point say, blessed are you, God, the cosmic imbecile, right? There's no reason, because if the words are homonyms, why are you so attached to these words, right? In other words, but just to understand how radical what Rambam is trying to do here is, okay? We can't say, in other words, God is at the very top of a scale at which I am at the very bottom. God is really smart. I'm just a tiny smidgen smart, right? No. The whole point on some level of Maimonides' theology is there is no scale that God and human beings are both on. That's what it means, he thinks, to worship a God who is truly transcendent and other than we are. That is, for the Rambam, the fundamental truth of theology. God is absolutely other and incomparable to creation in every way. I mean, here, by the way, you realize, I mean, if you just sort of sit with this for a minute, why many traditional Jews needed to insist that the Rambam didn't really write the God of the Perplexed, right? Because what he's saying is shocking for anything approaching a traditional Jewish theology. Maimonides wants to caution us again and again, be careful, lest, instead of worshiping God, you worship a glorified version of yourself. So far from being monotheism, you would actually be engaged in idolatry. And in some ways, that's the stick of dynamite Maimonides throws at an awful lot of Jewish piety. They call themselves monotheists, but they're idolaters. Maimonides says, for example, in the beginning of his letter on treatise on resurrection, there are many, many rabbis who are experts in halakha and absolute pagans. They know a ton about halakha. They know nothing about metaphysics, and therefore the God they are serving is merely a projection of themselves. According to Maimonides, then, God is a completely unknowable mystery, a kind of cosmic black box. And the only appropriate human posture towards God is silent adoration, which is why Maimonides is obsessed with the verse, L'cha dumiyat tehillah. To you, silence is praise. So God is, for Maimonides, the supremely perfect being. Though again, perfect in a way that there's no relation to any human perfection. Absolutely transcendent and eternally unchanging. Maimonides is relentless in drawing out the implications of this approach. Book 1, chapter 52 of the Guide, Maimonides says, God cannot enter into relation with any created thing, including, it bears emphasizing, human beings. Now, why am I going on about this in a lecture about Heschel? Because the consequences of what Maimonides is saying are dramatic. So dramatic that Heschel argues they are totally devastating to the very possibility of an authentically biblical faith. What Maimonides has just done is very interesting, but it has also liquidated Judaism. That's Heschel's claim, right? If we accept Maimonides' philosophical assumptions and the conclusions that derive from them, then we can no longer say such basic things as God cares, God loves, God has a relationship with us, there is a covenant between God and the Jewish people, and or God and humanity. Even more fundamentally, we can't speak of a personal God at all, since any attribution of personality to God is making God seem like a person and is actually idolatrous. But if we can't say that God cares or loves, or that God enters into relationship with human beings, are we still talking in any meaningful way about something we can recognize as the God of Tanakh or the Talmud? Heschel's argument is, and this is the reason for this little detour, is, of course we are not. We are no longer talking about the God of the Bible or the sages. We are talking about the God of Aristotle, masquerading as a Jewish God. The God of Israel, revealed in Scripture as a, quote, living God, and, as we'll see in a minute, a God of pathos, simply can't be reconciled or synthesized with the God of Greek philosophy. These are two totally different ways of thinking about the world and experiencing it. Attempts to force synthesis, such as the attempt of Maimonides, do violence to the legacy of the prophets, Heschel says. And they lead to the dissolution of everything that is distinctive and important and compelling about Jewish theologies. Philosophers like Maimonides may have had good intentions, but in assuming that they could integrate the God of Aristotle and the God of Israel, they effectively liquidated the God of Israel in the name of the God of Aristotle. Lo and behold, Heschel says in a particular cutting passage, every time someone tries to have a synthesis of the Bible and philosophy, the Bible capitulates and the God of philosophy wins. Lo and behold, what Tanakh is really talking about is the God of Aristotle. This is not synthesis, he says. It's surrender. It's capitulation. It's abandoning the idea that Judaism has a distinctive message and replacing it with Greek ways of thinking, to go back to the very beginning, that are foreign to it. That's the starkness. That's the Heschelian claim. Okay? Now, I want to take it one step further and talk about a God who actually matters, because Heschel takes this all one step further. The God of philosophy, the God you arrive at through proofs and arguments, Heschel argues, is actually simply irrelevant to anything human beings actually care about. Right? It's not interesting. Because even if you could prove the existence of God, the God whose existence you could prove just isn't all that compelling for the question human beings actually ask. Look at source 6 for a minute. Granted that the existence of a being endowed with supreme genius and wisdom has been demonstrated, the question remains, why should we, poor creatures, be concerned about him, the most perfect? We may indeed accept the idea that there is a supreme designer and still say, so what? As long as the concept of God does not overpower us, as long as we can say, so what, it is not God that we talk about, but something else. In other words, all that the God of philosophy can offer is order, a sense that the world is in some way designed. But the deepest human hungers are for something totally different. Look at source 7. We are more anxious to know whether there is a God of justice than to learn whether there is a God of order. Is there a God who collects the tears, who honors hope and rewards the ordeals of the guiltless? That's the Jewish question. And Maimonides, just to be clear, Maimonides' answer to that question is, of course not. That God doesn't exist. It is to this God, the God who cares for the vulnerable and downtrodden, that biblical revelation attests. In stark contrast, source 8, the God of the philosophers is all indifference, too sublime to possess a heart or to cast a glance at our world. Heschel says, and if you want to look at source 9, you can, that what animates a living soul is not a dead cause, but a living God. Not a dead cause, but a living God. A dead cause meaning I go back and back and back and back until I find the first cause. That's right, the classic Aristotelian formulation. And he says, what human being who is not tenured in philosophy is interested in that God? What people are interested in is a living God. Our goal is to ascertain the existence of a being to whom we may confess our sins, of a God who loves, of a God who is not above concern with our inquiry and search for him, a father, not an absolute. In other words, Heschel says, a being that lacks the attributes of personal existence is not our problem. A living God is a God who cares. By the way, if you read this second paragraph of source 9 carefully, you'll also be able to see why Heschel does not take the idea of God put forward by someone like Mordechai Kaplan and many other liberal Jewish thinkers remotely seriously. Because a God, he thinks, who has less consciousness and concern than I do is not a God worth worshiping. That God is fundamentally inferior to humans, not superior to them. If I know more than God knows, that's not God. And if I care about suffering people more than God cares about them, that too is not God. I'm happy to flesh that out much more if people are interested later on. Okay? Now, I want to take this one step even further. There is, thus, right, according to Heschel, a vast and an unbridgeable divide between the God of Israel and the God of philosophy. And maybe it's important to underline, Heschel is not shy about his disdain for the latter. Right? Here's the key contrast, and in a way, it's the heart of what Heschel is doing. The purportedly exalted God of the philosophers, the great first cause, Heschel says, that God consists of being conscious of himself and oblivious to the world. That's a quote. God is off contemplating himself for all eternity. In contrast, quote, the God of the prophets is all concerned, too merciful to remain aloof to his creation, end quote. Heschel characterizes the God of Israel at one point in extremely poignant terms. Source 10, if you want to look at it. God does not judge the deeds of man impassively in a spirit of cool detachment. His judgment is imbued with a feeling of intimate concern. He is the father of all men, not only a judge. He is a lover engaged to his people, not only a king. God stands in passionate relationship to man. His love or anger, his mercy or disappointment is an expression of his profound participation in the history of Israel and all men. End quote. What is most unforgivable about Hellenistic thought for Heschel is the fact that the God of Aristotle, and by extension, the God of Maimonides, is utterly indifferent to the fate and well-being of other selves. God doesn't care about anything but God's self. That's the Greek God. To go back to terms I mentioned in the first lecture, reflexive versus transitive concern. Reflexive concern, remember, means I'm concerned with myself. Transitive concern means I care about selves other than myself. The argument that Heschel makes effectively is the God of Greek philosophy is all reflexive concern. God contemplates himself and himself alone. He manifests no transitive concern, no regard for anything other than God's self. In contrast, according to Heschel, and whether this is a great reading of all parts of Tanakh, we can leave for a discussion for later, the only concern that can be attributed to the God of Israel is transitive concern. God's concern is exclusively for others. Quote, while man's concern for others is often tainted with concern for his own self, God's care for his creatures is a pure concern. And many readers of Heschel, both kind of regular readers of Heschel and academic readers of Heschel, will then quickly begin to marshal sources where God seems to be quite concerned about God's self. Passages in Sefer Shemot, passages in Sefer Yechezkel. I think Heschel could have made the same point by saying, the overwhelming preponderance of biblical material suggests that. Then you could argue about it. But his point is, he's trying to draw a dramatic contrast here. And I want to sort of just for a minute explain what I think that is. Now this is my language, not his, but I think it's important because it really gets at why he thinks the God of Israel is worth worshiping and worth believing in, which is where it becomes interesting. Implicit, in other words, in Heschel is a really interesting hierarchy. The God of Israel is all transitive concern. The human being is an alloy of transitive and reflexive concern. Right? I care about myself, but I also at moments care about others. And the God of Aristotle and Maimonides is nothing but reflexive concern, or perhaps more accurately, no concern at all. In other words, in all the ways that matter most, or that ought to matter most to a religious person, and that do matter most to Heschel, Aristotle's God is less than a human being, not more. If the ultimate test of the worth of something is whether one can feel concern for something other than oneself, human beings are further on the path towards being worth something than the God of Greek philosophy. Because human beings, at least, have moments when we rise to the occasion and care about things other than our own self. But the God of philosophy spends all eternity contemplating only God's self. To say that again, perhaps even more simply, the God of Israel only cares about others. We are a mixture of care about ourselves and care about others. The God of philosophy only cares about himself. He, maybe we should say it, is less than we are. So, to take stock for a minute of where we've just come in trying to analyze what Heschel is moving towards. Heschel's challenge, as he sees it, is to rescue Jewish theology from the ravages of Greek thinking, as exemplified by Philo, that is, Maimonides, and to allow the biblical and rabbinic tradition to speak once again in their own voice, right? To rescue the real voice of canonical Jewish sources. Heschel, in other words, to say something that is totally obvious by now, is heir to a venerable tradition of insisting, in Pascal's words, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers. In something that I wrote a few years ago about the contemporary Jewish philosopher Michael Wishgrad, the way that I try to express this is there is an irreducible tension between scriptural covenantal monotheism on the one hand and abstract philosophical monotheism on the other. And the failure of Maimonides, according to people like Heschel and Wishgrad, is the refusal to confront that fact. Right? The insistence that, against all evidence to the contrary, I can actually synthesize those two things. That really, on some level, they are saying the same thing. Which, again, Heschel says, they are not. Okay, now, God in search of man. So as we've already seen, Heschel says, that's the core idea in Jewish theology. God in search of man. The sources I'm about to mention are Numbers 11 through 13. The God of Israel, Heschel writes, is, quote, not a supreme being, apathetic and indifferent to man, but rather a relational God, one who enters into relationship with human beings and depends upon them to help accomplish God's goals. Quote, for the accomplishment of his grand design, the Lord waits for the help of man. Or, as he puts it elsewhere, not only is redemption a necessity for man, but man is a necessity to redemption. The implication, this is where Heschel kind of begins to wander into some very bold metaphysical claims. The implication of the idea of God in search of man, he says, is the idea of what he calls divine pathos. And to say that in English for a moment, the idea of divine pathos is the idea that God feels. God's need means that God may be hurt and disappointed. God is in search of man, but human beings maintain the freedom to turn away. The consequences of that are that God's ideals may be flouted and God's aspirations thwarted. And if you asked Heschel, can you give me a proof text, he would throw a chumash at you. What else is it about? Right? It's about a God who reaches out only to be thwarted again and again. It is a text that takes extremely seriously both a divine call and the human freedom to resist that call. Now, I just collected a few passages from the book of the prophets. God may thus be afflicted with, quote, pain and disappointment, quote, sorrow, and even, quote, anguish. God's words at times can be, quote, plaintive and disconsolate. Quote, the heart of melancholy beats within them. God is, in other words, a God of pathos, afflicted by humanity's going astray. Now, I have a feeling, Heschel would say, oh, you think you don't really like how that sounds? I'm sorry, but that's the God of Tanakh. I'm trying to take seriously Tanakh on its own terms. That's the Heschelian argument. Source 14, according to Heschel, this idea that God can be intimately affected, that he possesses not merely intelligence and will, but also pathos, basically defines the prophetic consciousness of God. It defines the prophetic consciousness of God. Remember, for Maimonides, anything you say like that is idolatry. Heschel says, really? Actually, what that is not idolatry, it's the core of biblical faith. It's the very core of the Bible, a God who feels and responds emotively. The God of Israel is a God who loves, a God who is known to and concerned with human beings. God not only rules the world in majesty, this is now Heschel's, God not only rules the world in the majesty of his might and wisdom, but reacts intimately to the events of history. He does not judge man's deeds impassively and with aloofness. Impassively is an important word. Impassively means unpenetrated by feeling. His judgment is imbued with the attitude of one to whom these actions are of the most intimate and profound concern. God does not stand outside the range of human suffering and sorrow. He is personally involved in, even stirred by, the conduct and fate of man, end quote. So in other words, to go back to something I said last time, at the very heart of prophetic theology is an amazing paradox. The claim, the transcendent, majestic creator of heaven and earth is also profoundly vulnerable. That paradox, Heschel finds that paradox to be, I think in some ways, the most interesting thing Judaism ever claimed about the world. That the transcendent, majestic creator of the world is also profoundly vulnerable. The cost of real relationship is emotional vulnerability, even for an all-powerful God. That's the claim, right? The cost of real relationship is that you are vulnerable, even if you also happen to be omnipotent. So let me just actually stay with that for a minute and analyze it a little more deeply. It's crucial to emphasize that for Heschel, God's pain and suffering do not result from limits on God's power. It is likely tempting for some to misread Heschel in this way, but nowhere does he suggest that the God of Israel is somehow weak or limited. On the contrary, for Heschel, any limits on God's power are self-imposed. That is, God does not exercise all of God's power in the world. In order to have a relationship with other beings who are given freedom and dignity, God has to not exercise all the power God has. By the way, that's even true about you. In order to have a relationship with anyone, you have to not exercise all the power you have. There is no relationship without tzimtzum. There's no relatedness without self-contraction, the process of making space for the freedom of another. So the God that Heschel is talking about is not weak or limited. On the contrary, right? God's vulnerability is a consequence of God's self-transcendence, not of some intrinsic limit or weakness. The God of Israel, in other words, has chosen to enter into covenant and relationship with human beings, to need human partners and to respect human agency. In history as it unfolds, God chooses not to exercise God's omnipotence. But in the end of days, Heschel loves to say in various places, it is God who will redeem the world and not us. This is where he has no truck with a certain kind of modern American liberal theology that says, there is no Messiah and we're all it, right? That's just kind of like, it's just like unserious nonsense. Meaning, really? Have you ever tried to fix anything? How'd it go for you, right? Right? You don't fix ultimate things. Human beings don't fix ultimate things. They work on trying to ameliorate problems. They work on trying to respond to evils, but they're not going to redeem the world. You can't make it perfect. That depends on God. By the way, please don't mishear what I just said. That doesn't mean that because ultimate redemption depends on God, human beings are now off the hook in terms of trying to fix the brokenness of the world. It means fix the brokenness of the world, but don't be under any illusions or delusions of what human beings are capable of. Heschel, by the way, develops this in a very nice linguistic distinction between, he says this is a distinction between divine passion and divine pathos. Divine passion, such as he finds in Christianity, is about what happens to a limited God, right? A limited God have something happen to him suffers because he can't avoid it. Divine pathos, on the other hand, is what a powerful God chooses to allow to happen in the name of entering into relationship. Just to read you for a second. Actually, you know what? I don't need to do that. Let's keep going. So in other words, to use a term that's mine, not his, God's sufferings as a result of human beings are the travails of an omnipotent God. They are not the sufferings of a weak, vulnerable God who wishes he could make it better but can't. Heschel wants to be careful. And this is really the next point I want to make. And I think it's really important that it's, Heschel's attempt to wrestle with the philosophical bludgeons that are now being pulled out by some people in this room to attack him with, right? He wants to say, in attributing emotions or pathos to God, he wants to make sure that he's not just projecting a giant version of us upwards, right? A very big person with very wonderful feelings, right? So let's look for a second at how he tries to do that. How, in other words, is divine pathos about divine pathos and not just about divine pathos? I wish I thought of that phrase when I wrote my book. I think it's a good, right? It's about the divine pathos and not just the divine pathos. I think it's a very important, yes?
Can you please explain again what is divine pathos?
It is the idea that God has feelings. You can take out the word pathos if you want to, and put in emotion or feeling. Does that help? Okay. Heschel tells us, quote, that divine pathos is a free reaction of the Lord to the conduct of man. To affirm divine pathos, he emphasizes, is not to suggest that God is subject to involuntary emotional changes or mood swings like we are. God is not emotional in the ways that I am emotional. Volatile, dynamic, unpredictable, out of control. Sorry, I wandered off the reservation there for a minute. Divine emotion, Heschel contends, is inextricably bound up with divine freedom. Here we have an enormous distinction between human emotion and divine emotion already, right? In the world of the prophets, he writes, quote, pathos was understood not as unreasoned emotion, but as an act formed with intention, depending on free will, the result of decision and determination. God's emotions, in other words, are also, so first we say they're free, and they are also, he says, quote, always morally conditioned. They're never a function of God's whim. God, why did you act this way? I felt like it. Why do you love some people? Because I feel like it. God, in other words, is utterly free, but also not capricious. These are already two huge caveats that are meant as contrasts to the way human emotion all too often works. Human emotion is not, if I said to you, how would you most fundamentally describe your own emotional life? You probably would not say what the fundamental term that describes my emotional life is. It's utter freedom. I decide when I feel resentful. I decide when I feel jealous. I decide, etc., etc. And you probably wouldn't say, and if you would either be delusional or just insufferable. Also, my emotions are always morally conditioned, right? There's never anything immoral about my feelings. I'm only jealous when it's in the name of righteousness and goodness. In other words, God's emotions are something God chooses, Heschel wants to argue, rather than something that happens to God. They are moral, not self-involved or volatile or unpredictable. Okay, we're going to come to this a little bit more deeply in a minute. But first, let's talk a little bit about the notion of a God of love. Because the core animating divine feeling, Heschel argues, is, in one word, love. According to him, the cardinal, fundamental divine emotion is love. There may be moments of genuine anger and disappointment, but at bottom, with God, there is always, always love. Heschel loved the prophet Hosea because it was he thought, who most eloquently expressed God's undying love for Israel. Heschel writes at one point that, quote, Hosea is able to express as no other prophet the love of God for Israel in its most varied forms, as compassion, as a mother's tenderness, as love between a husband and a wife. When Israel was a child, Hosea hears God say, I loved him. It's Hosea chapter 11. One of the central tasks of the prophets, Heschel reminds us, is to instill in the people the, quote, sacred certainty, end quote, of God's abiding love for them. But here's the argument he wants to make, and here I want to sort of say this is not just his apology for the Bible. I think he's actually doing something really interesting here, which I'll try to explain in a couple minutes. He argues that God's love is inextricably woven with God's anger, or Heschel prefers the term wrath. But I find that term, honestly, a little frightening, so I prefer to talk about anger. No, I'm actually sort of serious. Heschel argues that divine anger is not a contradiction to divine love, but on the contrary, divine anger actually emerges from the very heart of divine love. God's anger is a function of God's disappointed love. God turns to the prophets to help Israel turn back, and thus to assuage God's anger. Source 16. Man is rebellious and full of iniquity, yet so cherished is he that God, the creator of heaven and earth, is saddened when forsaken by him. Profound and intimate is God's love for man, and therefore harsh and dreadful can be his wrath. In other words, anger here is totally disentangled from hatred. Anger, the argument goes here, is a manifestation of love. Source 17, God so loves man that he does not tire of uttering through the prophets his outrage at the wrongs done unto man. That's not a bad definition, it occurs to me, of the distinction between righteousness and self-righteousness, right? Is that righteousness critiques injustice out of a profound place of love, and self-righteousness critiques injustice out of a place of fundamental disdain for everyone but me. I always actually like to say the difference between a prophet and an anti-Semite is a prophet turns to the Jewish people and says, you're totally blowing it. It's disgusting, it's despicable, and I love you more than anything. An anti-Semite forgets that last phrase. Right? That's extremely important to Heschel, how we read the Bible, because the same Amos, for example, who some of you are studying with me now, who can rip Israel to shreds, can turn in the next instant to God and say, maybe you could forgive him because he's so small. Kikaton. Like such profound tenderness that comes at the very same moment of attack, of moral condemnation, is intertwined with a sense of tender love. The possibility of divine wrath is implicit, Heschel thinks, in the affirmation of divine personality or personhood. You can't talk about God in personal terms unless you're at least willing to consider the possibility that God gets angry. And I want to actually just now say something about how this connects to what I just said about these caveats on divine feeling. Heschel emphasizes that divine wrath, like divine emotion in general, is not inscrutable and is not irrational, but is instead explicable as God's, quote, voluntary and purposeful response to egregious human misconduct. God's anger is, quote, it is not, quote, impulsive or automatic, but is instead rooted in divine decision. It is always, quote, conditional and subject to God's will. This is, by the way, I would argue, why Chazal, the sages, were extremely nervous and never would have said, oh, we're commanded to walk in God's ways, just as God gets angry, so should you. One of the main reasons they would never have said that is they were extremely concerned with the idea that no human being maintains his freedom in the face of anger. Right, there's a line in, I think it's in Breshit Rabbah, where one of the Moraim, I think it is, says, God is the master of God's anger, but anger is always the master of us. Now, by the way, whether you would read Chumash and always assume that God is the master of God's anger is an interesting question, right? That's a critique of what Heschel's doing. In other words, although Heschel's God is deeply personal, that God is not subject to the idiosyncrasies of what he calls temperament or propensity. Anger comes about in the light of moral judgment rather than in the darkness of passion. That's his comment. Okay, so anger is conditioned by ethics. Now, just to read one more time to emphasize this point, source 18, the normal and original pathos is love or mercy. Anger is preceded as well as followed by compassion. Now, what animates God's anger? And here you will, if we wrestle with this, you actually come to understand why this is actually extremely important to Heschel and why it becomes even more important to him after the Shoah. Source 19. Divine sympathy for the victims of cruelty is the motive of anger. Divine sympathy for the victim of cruelty is the motive of anger. God's responsiveness is a dramatic contrast to human indifference. Human beings may remain unmoved in the face of callousness and brutality. Right? Is the genocide going on in what country is it in Africa again? And by the way, what's a good new restaurant on the Upper West Side? Right? So God is set up as the dramatic contrast. God is understood as utterly different from the human capacity to be totally unmoved by the suffering of others. God is different in that God is, quote, always personally affected by what man does to man. This is one of divine anger's most important implications, in Heschel's words, the end of indifference. And here, Heschel's post-Holocaust voice emerges with enormous power and clarity. Source 20. To a generation afflicted by the fury of cruel men, by the outrage of abandoning God, no condemnation is too harrowing. The message of wrath is frightful indeed. But for those who have been driven to the brink of despair by the sight of what malice and ruthlessness can do, comfort will be found in the thought that evil is not the end, that evil is not the climax of history. What he's saying here is actually kind of amazing, and it's worth slowing down for a minute to think about. If, as he likes to say, indifference to evil is even more insidious than evil itself, then divine anger is a paradoxical form of consolation. It assures the victims that their sufferings are not forgotten, that the unspeakable pain they endure does not go unnoticed. Heschel here, in a really interesting way, I don't have another way of saying this, turns the tables on a lot of sort of traditional Christian attacks on the God of the Bible. Oh, your God is angry? He says, your God is sugar and sweetness in this universe? Really? And I am supposed to respond to you? By the way, if you're interested in like French feminist theory, this is a classic example of what French feminists call reversing the gaze, right? Where the classic view, right, is, oh, Judaism should be held accountable in light of a claim about kind of love and compassion being the only animating feature of the divine. And he says, you know what? I would like to ask you a question. A God of sweetness and light in a world of unresponded to genocide, I'm going to apologize to you that I don't conform to your standards. My God actually cares about that. Now, by the way, that Christian attack on Judaism is an unfair reading of Judaism, and that implicit Jewish attack on Christianity is an unfair reading of Christianity. But I think what's important here is the refusal of the idea that divine anger is something Jews should be extremely apologetic about and queasy about. Divine anger, Heschel says, is a way of making a dramatic metaphysical claim. Even though we don't live like this is true, the suffering of innocent people matters with a capital M. That's one of the fundamental claims of the Bible. The people no one notices are noticed. Even though anger, he says, quote, may be reprehensible when associated with malice, it can be a blessing as well, quote, morally necessary as resistance to malice. So, back for a minute to the meta level. What is he doing? Heschel is aware, obviously, that there are good reasons to hesitate about attributing anger to God. Because in human beings, anyway, anger is deeply entwined with impulsiveness. If that sounds like abstract, just ask yourself, when the last time you reflected on something you said in a moment of absolute anger and said, I'm so glad I said it just like that, right? That never happens because you lose your freedom in that moment. So Heschel understands that there's a nervousness about attributing anger to God. Because those qualities, impulsiveness, out of controlness, any theologian, forget about a theologian, any normal person would be nervous about attributing to the divine. So Heschel finds himself in a bind, wanting to affirm divine anger on the one hand, both because it's key to the prophets, and because I think it's key for him to be able to go on living. And yet, he sees the obvious problem with doing that. And he solves this problem to develop what I started doing before with a series of crucial caveats. 1, God's anger is not capricious, it's voluntary. 2, it's free, meaning that God doesn't lose control of God's self because he's angry. 3, it's moral. And 4, it's transitory. The default position is always love. So he wants to have a God who's angry, but only a God whose love is more fundamental than anger. Whether you think that's a compelling reading of Tanakh or not is an important question. I actually think it's not a bad reading of Tanakh. It's actually, in many ways, a good reading of Tanakh, of the overarching thrust of Tanakh, even though you and I could both start mustering texts and say, really, that what comes across here? But I think his point is, in terms of dominant thrusts, that is the dominant thrust. Okay, I want to say one last thing, and then I will run out of time. About anthropomorphism, and a term that Heschel liked, anthropopathism, the idea of attributing human emotions to God. So is everything that I just said about Heschel, does it make him helplessly anthropomorphic? Is Heschel's God just a huge and more perfect version of us? Maimonides undoubtedly would have said, yes. And Heschel, as we've seen, would have countered that Maimonides was, tragically, as good as an atheist where the God of the Bible is concerned. So then you can have this pretty unconstructive, if interesting, back and forth. You are an idolater. Right, fine, maybe, but you're an atheist. And in the end, that's not a very fruitful path, right? Rather, it might be useful to ask, how does Heschel think he can manage this charge of anthropomorphism? Biblical texts, he insists, are keenly aware of the difference between what he calls anthropomorphic conceptions on the one hand and anthropomorphic expressions on the other. Anthropomorphic conceptions means I think of God as human. Anthropomorphic expression means, given that I'm human, and that's the language that's available to me, I sometimes will speak in human terms about God. The use of the latter, he says, does not necessarily prove belief in the former. In other words, the language of pathos serves, quote, not to project human traits into divinity, but rather to try and offer insight into God's relatedness to humanity. All of this is encapsulated by Heschel's assertion, wonderfully played in Isaiah 55, Kilo machshavotay machshavoteichem, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Source 21, my pathos is not your pathos. Neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my pathos than your pathos. My feelings are not your feelings. I am not impulsive, out of control, unfree, and not conditioned by morality. Indeed, according to Heschel, and it is really easy to miss this, the very importance of divine pathos depends precisely on God's remaining precisely other. As he puts it, regarded as a form of humanization of God, the profound significance of this category of pathos is lost. If all God is a big version of us, who cares that he cares? What this means, I think, is that for Heschel, what is crucial is not that someone cares about human suffering, but that God does. That's what I was groping towards when I said that what's important about divine pathos and not